Well, first off, thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, I am Carol Davis Smith, and this is really loud, and I'm trying to whisper really loud. There we go. They got it. Okay. So over the years, I periodically have come up with, gosh, I wonder, what about, right? And this is actually an idea that I've been playing with for probably 20 years, which is the expansion of healthcare out into the broader community, if you will, beyond the bricks and mortars of this environment we think we control called the hospital, right? And over the years, things have moved out. When I was a young clinical engineer, one of the supervisors I worked with had the monthly assignment of going out to people's homes and checking their dialysis machines because they dialyzed at home. This was early 90s, right? So this idea of equipment and technology in the home is not new. We certainly saw an acceleration over the days of the pandemic, at least as far as talking to your physician over an iPad connection kind of thing. But I began thinking, as reimbursement changes and as our lifestyles change, and all of the things that we became accustomed to over the last 2-3 years, what does the life of HTM look like in the home? Probably close to 20 years ago, I gave a presentation about how the reimbursement was changing, and I challenged the BMEDs and the clinical engineers in the room, and I said, someday you're gonna have to come to this cranky old clinical engineer's house, right? Because I don't want to age. I want to age in my home. I don't want to age in a hospital or that sort of environment, right? And so I see if I can figure out which way to click this. That's clearly not the right button. There we go. So as time went on, as the pandemic went on, how many of you saw this? Best Buy, Geek Squad, medical device near you. Ah, yeah. Lots and lots in the news. How many of you saw this? How many of you have heard the company Medically Home? All right, overachiever. It's okay. Yeah. Right. Medically Home is a company who sprang up, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert on them, but essentially this telehealth thing is core to their business. How do they enable health systems to telehealth with their customers, right? In a we've built it sort of way. Well, as you might imagine, very quickly came that. Every one of those players is playing big time in this medically home, hospital at home. That's a term you've probably heard. Have you heard that one? Hospital at home? Okay. The first thing that freaked me out is probably like you guys. When I think of the hospital, the first places I think of the OR, the ICU, whatnot. Because even when I was interning, my mentors would say, the med surgs are here, we have to take care of them, but this med surg stuff is going to go away from the hospital. Well, that was 30 years ago. Healthcare is not the fastest to, advance and accept new ideas. So maybe we're there, right? The patients that are in these programs are typically chronic care and typically med surg like patients. Okay, this is, don't think, at least yet, ICU. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, why shouldn't I think ICU? Right? Because hospitals are kind of crazy sometimes, right? We do crazy things. If you think about your other hat, where you're a consumer, how often have you or a family member or a friend been sent home and you thought, wow, they went home really quick, I'm not sure this was a good idea? Does it ever happen? I've experienced that. So I said, all right, what's really going on? I started doing more reading. And what you see in the news a lot of times is patient uptake, patient adoption. Will people do this? Can they use an iPad? Will they do this? Blah, blah, blah. But there's more and more chatter now about the infrastructure, being successful or not? How many of you during the pandemic saw the news stories about kids trying to go to school online? And I don't care whether you were in rural America or downtown major metropolitan area. There are holes. Everybody does not have a smartphone. Everybody does not have, never mind high-speed internet, any internet, unless they can find a McDonald's down the street or something, right? That's not ubiquitous. It's not everywhere, right? So now there's a fair amount of conversation about, can the infrastructure support this idea of hospital at home and that this future of healthcare? So then I started thinking, started asking friends, calling friends, right? What do you think? What have you seen? What are you doing? And these three kind people decided they would humor me, all of whom I have had the pleasure of working with over the years. My dear friend Dave Scott, who you may have listened to his presentation about wearables, which was sort of like a preamble to this conversation. My friend Rafia Sakib, who is here in the Houston area, along with my other friend, Rick Bowie. Rick and I had the opportunity to work together in a prior life. And they have agreed to humor me with a conversation where I'm going to tell you we don't have a whole lot of answers. Our objective here today is, what are the questions we should be asking? What are the dark corners we should be peeking into? What are the things right in front of us that we should be looking at? So to get us started, I'm going to ask each of them, and Dave, happy for you to start because you're holding the microphone there. If you would just please give the folks here in the room a brief background on who you are, from whence you come, and then really tell us what, if any, experience do you have, in your work in Denver with the idea of hospital at home or home care, and how that intersects with your life as a HTM professional.
My name is Dave Scott. I'm from Denver, Colorado, as she said. I work at UC Health. I did a presentation earlier today on wearable medical devices, and I'm actually not only a wearable medical device user, but I'm also a wearable medical device patient, because some of the wearable medical device information that I've been able to collect using my own information, such as ECG readout from my watch, I was able to schedule with my doctor without ever stepping into the doctor's office a nuclear stress test. So I didn't even have to step in the doctor's office. I was able to export the report, send it as an attachment through my health app to my cardiologist. And the cardiologist said, yes, you have AFib. We're going to schedule you for a stress test. Let me know if they don't contact you within a week. So that's kind of some of my personal experience. When I'm a military trained biomed, and probably about 30 plus years ago, we had something called military medical benefits plan, and we had equipment in people's houses, and I worked on patient lifts, even on vans, I guess, and patients' vans. And I went in patients' homes and looked at some of the beds or problems they were having with medical equipment. And then I guess more recently, we've seen more and more stuff moving to in-home, it seems like. So that's my experience. Also, when I was in the military, one of the things we were trying to do, and it was just after Desert Storm, was something called telehealth. And it was kind of like a doctor on one end and someone on the other end, and they could actually do like vital signs and so on, and it transmitted. And we saw that kind of come up during COVID, a lot of telehealth appointments. So it was kind of like, man, I remember this from the early 90s when I was talking about this. I actually went to an all-day class with, I don't remember the name, we'll say AT&T, someone that made like phone systems and that kind of thing, that we were going to do this telehealth thing back then. And the internet really didn't exist as much as it does today. So it was something very new back then.
Good afternoon. My name's Rick Bowie. I'm been in this field for 31 years, I guess now. Also military trained biomed for about 14 years before going into management. Worked for GE Healthcare for 18 plus years, Kaiser Permanente for 6 years, and now I'm with Memorial Hermann here, local in Texas. My experience with this really came up as the pandemic was starting to wind down, and we had a lot of excess ventilators, infusion pumps. We were trying to stand up our surge warehouse and even implement a service depot and a parts depot, but more so a warehouse to house this stuff, and how do we rotate it in and out of our normal inventory. If your infusion pump breaks, send it to the warehouse, we'll pull one off the shelf, put it in place, and we'll repair that one and put it back on the shelf instead of the equipment just sitting there and idle. So we started thinking about home healthcare and how might we use that warehouse or that surge service depot as kind of a base of operations, because to Carol's point, I don't think anyone really knows what the model is going to look like. I'm sure there'll be various models, whether it's the Geek Squad, where we're driving to people's homes and working on equipment right there, working on equipment in a mobile van, a biomed shop on wheels, or if it's more of the Amazon, hey, we ship you a new one, take it out of the box, put your old one in the box and ship it back to us, and we'll take care of it at a warehouse. Those are the things we were starting to think through as I transitioned from KP to Memorial Hermann. Now I'm trying to build that relationship with our home health director and understand what they're already doing, because as you know, we already have devices in people's homes, and how that rotates in and out, and how we can work together and tie into that. So,
hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Hopefully, everybody's enjoying MD Expo here in Houston. I am in MD Anderson. I have an electrical engineering background, been in clinical engineering for almost 20 years now. Did start off from the bench, worked my way up, and have had the pleasure of working with people like Carol and my lovely staff who's here with me today. Just been in clinical engineering. It's my life. I breathe it. It's my passion. And so naturally, my experience with the home health, working at MD Anderson and since the pandemic, is not as extensive, or even doesn't even begin to compare with my colleagues here. But I will say that we are venturing into home health devices, quote unquote, because they're easy and they're easy to implement, and there's all kinds of ease surrounding like a wearable device. It's just easy technology. It works on the internet, and there's a lot of room for sort of the non-biomed qualified folks who can implement the technology. And of course, we'll talk about not having the answers today, but asking the questions. So we definitely want to look at what, and I know I'm going to talk about risk later, but we definitely want to venture into what kind of person or technician rather, we want to see supporting these devices in the home side. I know at MD Anderson, these have been conversations. Of course, we are a cancer center, not a regular trauma center, as my colleagues may be. So we really haven't ventured in implementing a home health program, but we do have a sort of a list of devices that potentially go home with the patient. And so it's not yet a formal program yet, but we're venturing into that, I suppose. And then of course, using the wearables and using devices like Echo Dots and wireless devices, we definitely want to venture into this. And I will be calling you guys when it comes for that time. So pleasure being here.
Super. Okay, so you can see my colleagues and I, we've been watching this a little while, right? How many of you in the room actually work with your home health department, your home health team now? Do you interact with them at all? Okay. How many of you know where your home health team is? I would kind of recommend that you check in there and kind of find out what they're doing. I was fortunate enough to get, I don't even remember what the nature of the project was when I was early in my career as staff engineer, and ended up over in their department and had the opportunity to ask a million questions, which is probably why they were really glad when I finished whatever project it was I was doing. But, you know, that's a different regulatory world. So the first thing I want to start with, because all of us every day, all day worry about when Joint Commission's coming in, right? We don't want to get dinged. We want to get it clear. Our bosses want clear, because that means we get paid, right? I mean, I'm the first to say it's about patient safety, but honest to goodness, it's about money, folks. The doors don't stay open. There is no mission without a margin, right? You don't get paid, you can't serve your community. So it's important for us to realize that home health has not the same regulatory life that we do, okay? And so I started talking with my colleagues here and posed the question to them, and we'll start with Dave just on this one. We all sort of drew straws. They drew straws. But my question was, actually there's a couple of them, like, how do we define the environment of care when it's no longer defined simply by the walls of our hospital? What, if any, CMMS regulations exist today? I'm guessing there's probably something in there about home health because they get paid. And there's been stuff in the news about how they're not happy about what they're getting paid or not paid, okay? And what role do we think the Joint Commission will do, is doing, might do? So I'll shut up. And Dave, what are your thoughts on that? And there are no wrong answers. I want to say right now, there are no wrong answers because I think we all have a very fuzzy crystal ball.
From my research on the wearable medical equipment, from what I could tell, most of it started out in fitness industry, and it was for fitness trackers and how many steps you take and walking and how much you're standing during the day. And pretty much all of that equipment was not classified by the FDA. So the FDA has type 1, 2, and 3 equipment. And type 1 is just general equipment like stethoscopes, really low-end equipment that probably most likely will not injure a patient or the user. And then this type 2 was equipment that could possibly, if used wrong, injure the user or the provider. And that was something like an ECG machine. And then the type 3, sorry, was equipment that could injure the user and the provider, or the user and the patient, which is something like a defib. I think a lot of this equipment, I don't know, the home health equipment where it fits in, most of my research was in the wearable devices, and it wasn't really classified by the FDA. So some of this home health equipment I see is provided by, like, a lot of time by an outside company. I was aware of an outside piece of equipment, and it was a Holter monitor that I wore for about a month. And it was just basically a sticker that went on my chest. And I have some hair on my chest, and I had to shave it every so often and stick that sticker back on because the sticker was electrodes, and it got replaced I think it was every 3 days or 5 days, I don't remember now. Then it had a little click-in piece that was like almost the size of your car remote, like the little, and it popped in there, had some contactors on there. That piece removed, and then I replaced the sticker, popped the thing back in, and it read to a phone. The phone was sending information to a monitoring center that monitored my ECG 24 hours a day. So it was something that was, I guess, not really, I wouldn't classify it as, I kind of think of it as not really medical equipment, but it was definitely medical equipment. So that's,
Well, Holter equipment has been around
a
for
long time.
decades,
Yeah,
right?
we've had
Do
Holter.
any of you guys still
So
have
that's-
Holter
that's a,
in the hospital?
That's a home health that's been around for years.
Well,
Holter
and
equipment.
I remember when it was in the hospital and they wouldn't let patients out until they'd been on a Holter for 72 hours. That's when we got paid different too.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is driven, like Carol said, the dollar is what drives a lot of this, and what we can bill for and what we can't.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think we need to be aware that, back to the dollar, there are players like Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, Apple, that have a lot of money and can lobby the government to potentially change rules. So whether that's getting some of these wearables FDA clearance, or keeping them out of the quote unquote environment of care, or expanding them, we don't really know, but we've got to start looking at that and asking those questions, because those are the disruptors that are going to change the landscape.
How many in the room know who their accreditation coordinator, supervisor, director person is for the whole hospital? Everybody, anybody that's a manager better know who they are, right? You need to know who that person is, because the rules change even in our controlled environment. So great point there. Okay, so any thoughts from anybody in the room? I mean, are you seeing or hearing anything from a regulatory? What are you reading? Nothing yet? All right.
It seems like the environment of care can be almost anywhere now, but I don't know if it's going to fall under the accreditation part, because no one's going to go, the surveyors aren't going to go to someone's house, but they're making to ask you how you manage that and how you know that it's an appropriate program. Did you have something to add? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Here, hang on one sec. Let me, because they're recording the session, so I want to make sure we capture this. So you came from dialysis.
Yeah, so I came from dialysis, and that was home dialysis was what I was piggyback off what you said. They didn't go to houses, but the tech had to keep binders. They had to do like an audit of the home environment, the water system, make sure everything was still up to date. Filters were changed, PM was completed. If there was a problem, that work order or the log went in that binder, and they had a home station. So it would be like, say, for example, if MD has something like that, one of the main facilities or one of the hospital facilities will be that home hub. So when state or the Joint Commission shows up, they know, hey, we're here for your home health. Where's all show us everything we need. We need, the PMs, we need cultures, we need all the records. So your home hub, that would be what they would go for, as the home hub to check everything.
That's a great point. Thank you for sharing that. How many of you know that Joint Commission surveys in like skilled nursing facilities and places like that? Are you guys aware of that? Okay. There's nothing, and there's others. It's not just Joint Commission. There's a whole accrediting team, HHC or something like that, that does nothing but. Yeah, and certainly in states, right, states. Yes.
Just doing a piggyback on what he said, especially nursing homes. If you have nursing homes attached to your hospitals, then I've faced this question by the regulatory body where they asked for oxygen concentrators, which you will find even on Amazon or everywhere. Just coming back to your point. So they wanted records which showed that it is being checked every 6 months. They went through each and every test. They asked if the alarm batteries are being checked, and what's the concentration of oxygen that's being delivered. So do you have the manufacturer's concentration? Is it 95 and above at 2 liters? That's the specs that they were asking, and they wanted to see the documentation of what the tech checked and what was the readings, so they go to that extent. Yeah.
So it's already happening. It's here. The train is out of the station. Thanks, Dave.
I wonder too, with all that there'll be self-checks, and the self-checks will record, and things will be more automated maybe in the future, because it seems like that would make sense to do that.
Well, it does, and we have a history. When we all joined this profession years ago, patient monitors had not a whole lot of intelligence. I mean, they were fabulous in terms of the clinical parameters, but today they do a lot of their own self-checks, right? And then we check logs. We do the, by exception, right? If something throws a flag, then we get worried about it, right? So that's a possibility, certainly a possibility.
If I may add to everyone's great comments here. The thing is, when we were looking at Holter monitors years ago, and some of the technology that was used before, technology's advanced literally exponentially, and there's just so much more. I'm going to be the naysayer, risk. So it's so much easier to cause harm in so many different aspects now.
And we can do it
So-
faster.
I like the question, how do you define environment of care? But the environment of care just offers so many more challenges, and it's so much more complex that it's not just straight up the patient and the fact that a device could be worn and that we're acquiring the data. It's the data itself. It's the software. It's there's so many more elements to define.
Right.
And my fear, I'll share with all of you. You all are experts. I really fear that something has to happen. It's just like a traffic light. You don't get a traffic light unless someone has an accident or someone passes away. That's my fear with the whole home environment and the regulatory piece. Regulatory will bring their hammer down, God forbid something has to happen for that. And that's my concern always when I think about this.
So ideally, hopefully this sort of a session and getting more people thinking, I'm gonna run that back there to him.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Will get us thinking, even if it's just a few of us thinking about what this looks like or could look like, maybe we can influence it, because truly technology is moving faster. Everything's moving faster. We need to try to get ourselves at least caught up to the train, if not maybe even a little in front of it. Yes, sir, in the back.
So home health has been going on for a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember my dad getting the big old honking oxygen concentrator delivered to the house 35 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that with, you know, the wearable monitors, Holter monitors going on, I think this is accelerating,
Mm-hmm.
right? To where pretty much you're going to have maybe an ICU patient at home,
Mm-hmm.
right? With all the things that come along with that, equipment that they have to bring into them, networking, privacy, all that kind of thing that goes along with it. So like a lot of stuff in medicine, is the technology gonna outrun the ethics about this? You know, because we'd like to have our loved ones at home. I'd like to be able to ambulate at home if I possibly can. But I think that's where environmental care, what you're actually able to provide at home, payments, face it, power requirements that are at their house, water, like you talked about before. So it used to be where the guy delivered an oxygen tank and that was it. You still see a lot of people walking around with those little oxygen tanks on them. So how do we even know those things are working?
Right. So interestingly enough, the universe as it is with me oftentimes, I was in between sessions down somewhere around, I think the check-in desk, right, for the conference. And this gentleman hustled up and said, wait, I need you. And he's off to catch a plane, but he's like, I want to talk to you. He works for a lab that tests home medical equipment. And he said that very thing. The first thing he talked about was infrastructure. And I said, that's definitely, and that's coming, right? But he talked about, you know, the power requirements, all the same things that, thankfully he wrote all this down because I never remember the numbers for standards. But there's an existing, long time existing Amy ANSI standard 60601-1. Sounds probably familiar to at least a few people, right? Well, take that -11 and it becomes the home healthcare. So it's out there. We've got some references. We got some places we can tie our boat to begin with. Sorry, mixed metaphors, trains and boats. Sorry about that. But the point being, oh, we have planes too. That's me. But so there are some regulatory things that have been around forever that we haven't had to pay attention to. So maybe we need to get more involved with those at some point. Was there a question or a comment in the back?
Here. Yeah.
More of a question or more of a comment than a question. So I did way back in the day work in home health and deal with some of that. And the concern being is, like you said, with the regulatory, you can buy all kinds of stuff online now. And so it's kind of like the genie's already out of the bottle. I mean, I can find certified X-ray components on eBay. And so where do we, you know, how do we get things back under control? Because you can buy just a myriad of items on Amazon or eBay or at the flea market or wherever that none of us have touched or hasn't been touched. And so it's a big hazard. We had a particular issue. Our TINS units were a controlled item for like home therapy. And we had to track them and check them between each patient. Well, it got so far out of control, and I don't know who made this decision, whether this was a regulatory decision or the hospital, but they finally just said, we're going to send the TINS unit home with the patient and it's theirs. That way then we're out of the loop as far as checking them and making sure that they're safe. Is that what's going to basically happen, that the patient's going to sign a waiver and here's your stuff and have a nice day?
You know, those are the things that we're kind of here throwing those questions out. And I'm going to use your comment as a segue to the next piece around implementation and maintenance. So the four of us talked a bit about this. I showed you some, you know, that initial slide about all the stuff that's coming online. We talked about going to McDonald's to do our homework and whatnot. I'll share a personal story and then I'm going to turn it over to Rick. This topic became very, very personal to me just a few years ago, actually during the pandemic, when my sister-in-law was sent home She had muscular dystrophy. And so if you're familiar with that disease, it's a neurological disease that affects your muscles and causes them to really just become very rigid. Most of the time it's diagnosed as a child. This was an adult diagnosis, which was traumatic enough in and of itself. But as you might imagine, at some point, the muscles that are used for your lungs, right, they are impacted by the disease, right? So at some point she had to be intubated and on one of the hospital visits. And as if that weren't bad enough, then it was sent to a SNF, some sort of skilled nursing, right? Where it was very clear they had respiratory therapists, like in the hospital, you know, when you're in the hospital, the RT's there, what, like 4 times a day, right? And there's always somebody around, and most of the nurses are pretty well trained in RT kinds of things. And you go to the skilled nursing now, you guys know there's no biomed on site there. The RT comes around a couple times a day, maybe, right? And then she was sent home. My brother was the caregiver, and myself. That's terrifying. I'm not an RT, right? The RT, the real RT, came like once a month, unless he called to say, come, right? And I am not a biomed. I do not have the skills that many of you have, right? How do you know that thing is working right? You know, it's sort of like, well, it kind of looks like it's, right? It became very personal, very quick, because we think about what is the training we do with folks when we implement a new technology in the hospital. We make sure the clinicians get training. My brother and I got about 3 hours of training. All right, go ahead and blame it on COVID, right? So this can get personal real fast, right? Real fast. But what we can control more is this implementation, or theoretically, we can influence. Let's say, not say control, but we could potentially influence the implementation and maintenance, I think. What do you think, Rick?
Well, I mean, even back to your point about, I'm going to stand up. Back to your point about devices that people can buy online. Today we have, I think at first, and again, I think what it will be, we don't really have the answers. This is about asking the right questions. But I think it will be at first a hospital by hospital decision. Today, I know hospitals that will not allow patients to bring their own CPAPs in because of infection control. Some of those things, if you've seen them, they're nasty when they come in with a patient. And so we control that. We say you're not allowed to use your own, you're going to have to use one of ours. Same thing when we put equipment in the homes. It may be, you might have bought that off Amazon, but you're not allowed to use that. If we're going to administer this program, then we're going to be under certain regulations, and you'll have to use our equipment. So I think that's, at first at least, hospitals will have to make those calls. But then I read about some places that have already kind of implemented this home health where they're getting more acute patients in the homes, but they're having, skilled nurses. I think they have 1 televisit a day and 2 in-person visits a day where they go to their homes and they visit them. But as that changes, you've got to start thinking about who is the user of this equipment. You're not going to have the nurse there at the home all the time. In some cases, less acute patients, the patient may be the user. In other cases, it may be a family member. And then you've got to think about education. How do you, if you bring a device in there or ship it to them, clear and concise instructions on how to set this up and then how to use it on a daily basis. So I think those are the types of questions we have to ask on implementation is how we roll that out and who are the users of this device, and the communication between the hospital and those homes. And then, back to the point about how do we support this? I know some companies are even looking at disposables. You give it to them, they implement. I know you said the TENS unit, they send them home and now it's yours. You send something home with them and they use it, and when they're finished with it, it gets thrown away. The other options are going to be, as we mentioned, here's your, that one's failing or there's a problem. Here's a box with a new one, set it up, put the old one in a box, ship it back to us, and we'll have a service depot or a place where we can support those. Or it's going to be a Geek Squad type. And when I say Geek Squad not talking about partnering with Geek Squad, although that's an option. Some healthcare organizations have already done that. You know, it's back to the build, buy, or borrow. Are you going to build your own? Or are you going to partner with someone who already does that? And mobile biomed shops and vans where you can work on the equipment, not in the house, but maybe outside the house in a mobile van and support it that way. I'd love to hear thoughts on how you guys think that support will take place.
So I can only speak on dialysis because that's what my background is. So with dialysis, how they have that set up is that they have that dedicated team at that hub station. The hub station has backup machines and backup ROs just in case if they cannot repair on site, they can easily swap out the machines or swap out that portable RO so the patient's not skipping treatment and they're able to take it back to in-shop to repair and fix. But it all comes down like you have to, I think the best way to go is to start with a dedicated team and try to see how that goes. Do we need more help? Can we do it with a certain amount of staff? How much staff is required for this? But no patient just initiates dialysis. They have an RN dedicated to that patient. Dialysis is 3 times a week, 3 to 4 hours. So that nurse will go there, checkpoint 1, and then go to the next one, checkpoint 2. The biomed will go there when the maintenance is due, or if the customer or the RN calls to say, hey, there's a problem, and then they show up with their van or the work van with the equipment. And if they can repair it, great. If they can't, they swap it out and the patient doesn't skip any type of treatment.
So that sounds like an incredibly good model, and it's clearly been tested over time. Because like I say, I knew people who did it 30 years ago. So it definitely seems like something we could adopt, adapt, adjust. But it really also seems like, you know, we've had a lot of conversation about wearables and things that are disposable, things that we probably wouldn't, almost like the finger clips that are occasionally used in the hospitals that just get pitched, right? But I think the question comes back to some of the questions that I've asked, or you guys have asked, is what's the criticality? What's the severity? What's the complexity of the disease state that we as an American community decide to push further away from the hospital out into the community at the SNF or even into the home?
I think we have another comment here.
Rick, something you mentioned was, let me paraphrase, we don't want you to use your junk, we want you to use our good stuff as we're administering healthcare, right? And Carol, one of your questions was around the environment of care. What do we define as the environment of care outside the 4 walls of the hospital? Maybe we turn this on its side a little bit. Maybe we can't define the environment of care. And maybe the federal government, if they're smart, I'm reaching here, maybe rather than that, they say, as a provision of care, you only use trusted sources to obtain information in order to make a medical decision.
That's a very interesting perspective, because even in the hospital environment, I have been asked as both a clinical engineer and as an executive to put all this patient data into the EMR. We want everything integrated. And when I started breathing again, I asked, is that FDA cleared devices, or do you want all the stuff that you're, or is this the blood pressure machine my dad bought at Walmart last night, or the SpO2 thing that they bought to hook into their iPhone at Best Buy? I mean, do you want all? No. I don't think I do. Do I? I don't know. So, right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think these are the conversations that we have to be prepared for. That's not up to us as the HTM community, but you raise an excellent. What is what do our clinician partners consider the trusted source in this future state, right?
Well, right. It goes back to data quality. And are we going to allow, anybody can make a home health device, but you don't know about the quality of the data. And is it good enough to make a diagnosis, a medical diagnosis off of, or does it have to be FDA cleared? Those are the questions we have to figure out. Is it only FDA cleared devices, and how far does that go?
Or is it a consumer product?
Right.
Was there another question back there? Yeah. Comment?
A quick tangent off of that, interestingly enough, which happened just a couple of weeks ago through a survey process. A unnamed vendor of stretchers is selling sold our hospital stretchers with scales on them. We've just kind of figured that out, and we've separated those models out because it's the same model number. It's an option. However, part of it is through the survey, we dug through the manual to determine PM requirements and that. And in the manual, it clearly states that the scale is not to be used for medical diagnosis.
Cool.
FDA approved product, don't use the scale
Cool.
for using weight.
So you see, I mean, it's even goofy in the hospital.
Yeah.
Wow.
That, huh? Yeah, exactly.
Well, everyone should be doing that. Remember, we're being recorded. Everyone should be reading the service manual and pulling out the PM procedure and frequency.
And this is an unnamed hospital as well. So, but kind of back into the conversation around the devices and use and those type of things. I think a very good point about what data is validated and do they want to see and use. I think a lot of this, we've had telehealth around for such a long time, and it is progressing. I'm going to kind of throw out my view is some of the models that we've got, like the dialysis model, that are not going to be sustainable. Technology is going to have to improve to the use because we're already having difficulty now getting nurses to come work in a hospital. How are you going to get more nurses that are going to have to deal with more patients on, even just a transport level? How big a circle of patients do I have to make and cover? In our hospital, a couple of things they've done. We're working towards, actually, we have remote nurses in the hospital itself that are doing discharge intake and discharge processes, and they sit at a desk and they just process those patients through simply to make sure to work towards that we have enough staff and nursing to hit ratios on the floor that we want to, but still get all of that work done. So I see a challenge that way there, that technologies are going to need to improve, that a device is going to become more self-sufficient, self-testing, those types of things.
So let me ask the panelists again, because teeing off or pivoting from yours, because I totally agree with all those nursing comments, is how many, what do you think, Rick, Dave, and Rafia, about staff? Not so much quantities, because we all know we're short-staffed and it's hard to find people. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I want to go down a different rabbit hole, which is, let's pretend we live in a world where there's lots of biomeds and clinical engineers and we don't have a shortage. Let's pretend we're living in that pretend world. Do they want to go into people's homes? Do they want to come to Carol's house, the cranky old clinical engineer, and
Not
service
your
my
house. They like to come to my house.
Okay.
But your house, I don't know. One of the things I was going to say about implementation, if you went to my presentation earlier, you know that my wife is on an insulin pump. Insulin pumps have been around for quite a while, and the way that they work, the newest one that she got is actually disposable. The pump part is disposable. She only wears it for 3-4 days, 5 days, I think it is. It has a fillable reservoir in it. She fills it with insulin. She has a glucose monitor so these are pieces that are owned by her. But when she goes into the endocrinologist, there's a middleware, it's called Gluco. The Gluco thing takes all of her readings off of her glucometer, sends it to the doctor's office. Doctor's office analyzes all this data before it comes in. It gives a lot of reports, and they're able to adjust, like her rates or whatever when she goes in there. It's all done. It can all be done remotely. She just recently switched to this new insulin pump, had some problems with it. And the problem was, I was talking to Rick earlier, she threw away the old sensor, but the device, it's a phone. It's a Samsung phone, I believe, that reads to that, and it was still reading the old one. We ended up getting a ferrite bag to put the old sensor in, or a magnetic shielding bag to put the old one in, so it couldn't read that anymore, so it could pick up the new one. We didn't know that. She had to call tech support, and they were actually able to help us. They said, move the trash can out to the, as far away as you can. And so I moved it out to the garage. Yeah. And then I decided, hey, we can just buy a bag and put the sensor in there, and then when it's done reading it. But She
So-
owns the device and they have a warranty, they call it. Every 5 years, she can get a new device. And if she has any problems, she calls this number and they help her over the phone. And so far, it's been actually worked really well. But that, all those reports are, it predicts A1C, so on to the doctor's office. So it's
So
pretty
in the
interesting.
interest of time, though, I need to keep us moving here real quick, and I want to go on. I don't want to miss this because I think risk management is maybe where we're at. And Rafia, if you,
Yeah, I just wanted to
Oh.
add one comment, and that is, you mentioned biomeds wanting to go into the homes of people. Nurses, you mentioned nurses. You know, it's one thing to deal with a patient on your turf in the hospital. When you're on their turf, that sounds a little strange, but they can become a little bit more belligerent, a little more bold and rebellious at home. So it's a whole dynamic. You know, I know we're going to get into this, but we haven't even touched on cybersecurity and encryption and all that. So.
yeah, I wasn't going to go down any of the technical rabbit holes in depth, but that's an issue from implementation and maintenance. So pivot us here, Rafia, to risk, and maybe we'll touch some of those other areas. So what are the things that when we do, we're all getting much better at risk assessments, right? Because of, all right, everybody in the room, how do you define risk? All right, now I'm scared. Probability and impact. Probability times impact. What bad thing can happen and how likely is it to happen? Okay, it's that simple. I can't tell you the number of times I've been asked recently, how do you calculate risk? Okay, that's really, really important. So on that, Rafia, what are your thoughts on that? Very simple calculation.
Well, if I had to speak to probability for risk management, we haven't even looked at that for home healthcare, right? And as I said earlier, the technology keeps getting advanced, but I don't think our severity of failure and impact to patient safety, patient care, patient diagnosis, we haven't visited those arenas. And as technology continues to advance faster than we can think, you have the PHI concerns and whether HIPAA is being breached. Patient privacy is another whole other element. And what I was going to comment on, now that we know that we have the AAMI ANSI standard that we can go back to, 60601-11.
60601-1-11.
Okay. So now that we know that, we need to start studying that, obviously. But what I was going to say for risk management is with the increase of capabilities in the home health arena, we haven't stopped to think, to this gentleman's great point, whether we should do that, right? That's one thing. And then we're not looking at the ecosystem of the environment of care, because increased technology increases the risk also. So the severity and the probability of failure, that's going to increase as well. So yeah, it's great. Yay, it's doing everything we need it to do. But then we're not looking at, the fact you are very technical, I would say, David. And so you know how to manage somewhat that risk. Carol, you're technical enough, you knew that there was a problem when your sister-in-law was going through. Sorry to hear that. But think about people who aren't technical, people who have no idea what technology does. And perhaps now there's more knowledge and education base, but that risk has gone up because we are dependent on the home healthcare initiative. We're trying to cut down costs in healthcare. And so I just have to ask a very basic question: as healthcare costs increase, which they have, what is the quality of care we're able to provide to our patients? And as a patient ourselves in cases, how well is our care being defined? And then that risk comes into play also. Is our diagnosis correct? Are we able to go through all those procedures and get the best care? And that's a question too.
Right.
So risk of missing probabilities of failure points, unless someone calls the biomed that was supposed to come in, right? You have to know to call somebody. And a lot of times, with all due respect to what clinical caregivers do at the site of use of devices, sometimes they miss a condition or a circumstance that should have been checked. So it's a whole ecosystem. I mentioned that because now with cybersecurity and PHI, now we got to work with IT and IS also and entertain those factors. So environment of care, that's a very hard question to answer right now, because there's just so many avenues of probability that we have not talked about as an industry. So as an industry, we need to visit these questions and concerns and really address those risks as best we can, really. I really like, Josh, you were mentioning the dialysis program. Perhaps that is a solution, but the whole problem with these devices that we're talking about is they haven't been through the UL lab testing, the CSA standards. We haven't put them through that. This is the reason we need a 510K clearance, right? Because of testing. So that's, and I have gotten those questions too. Can you just integrate the finger SpO2? I don't know. Should we?
Right, right. I have a saying that my kids and my students hear frequently, and my staff has heard frequently, which is just because we can doesn't mean we should.
Correct, exactly.
And I think we're sometimes in a unique position to say, I'm not saying no, I'm saying I'd like to look at something first, right? I'd like to verify. And we do this every day comfortably in the hospital. We say, I've never seen that piece of equipment before. I think I'd like, can I have the afternoon to dig into that, right? As fast as things are changing and as fast as the environment that we may or may not be working in, I would love to be wrong here. I would love to be wrong here.
Impact times probability is really surprising. When I was talking to Carol and she told about her sister-in-law that was on the ventilator at home, and what is the impact of that? We all know what the impact of that is. I don't know what the probability is, but I wanted to go back to Josh too. It's Josh, right? Did you ever have, when you were having home dialysis patients, someone that maybe wasn't able to be treated at home, because their home equipment wasn't working, and you ended up having to maybe bring them into the hospital, or like maybe a workaround? Is there workarounds for home health equipment?
It's an interesting question,
So
Dave.
before a patient got set up with home dialysis, they actually had a assessment team, right? The social worker will get involved with the MD. The MD will let the social worker know. There it goes. The MD will let them know if they have any history of, if they're able to take care of stuff, if they're negligent towards things. And then the assessment team will go into the patient's house with the patient's consent to do a survey of everything, kind of like they were doing an audit in the patient home, as in they're just checking if they had a water system, if they had outlets, what type of outlets do they have, and they would make the changes there. They were trying to minimize that happening. Now, I've only heard of if the equipment itself failed, they will swap it out. It would instantly get swapped out. So if the dialysis machine or yes, it will get swapped out. Yep, they'll call biomed. Biomed will go over there, see if it's what's wrong. If it's a blown fuse or a blown power logic board, they would swap out that machine that day, because they're not skipping patient treatment. Dialysis takes that very seriously.
So this actually takes us back maybe thinking, but thinking in terms of the world we live in today and the differentiation we make between high risk and not high risk and whatnot. Not to say that dialysis isn't high risk, right? I mean, that's a pretty complex, pretty gnarly treatment the patients have to go through. But if the equipment fails, you typically have time to do this shift. If we move to a future state where we're doing more than monitoring and doing more than therapies that are intermittent, if we go to, I'm thinking MD Anderson, cancer treatments that are prolonged, likely guessing that they would go through a similar cycle, although probably faster than insulin, where that's pump delivered to begin with, and then ideally something more like the insulin pumps they use today. But we've got a whole host of chemistry and fluid dynamic things that would have to be addressed. But so I think, this idea of getting really comfortable with the stuff that's life supporting and continuous versus things that are intermittent and strictly monitoring seems to be a little bit of a theme coming out of here. Yes, sir.
Maybe I'll wrap up the audience participation here in summary, since we're almost at time, but point that Rafi made regarding limited visibility by the healthcare ecosystem to what's going on, right? Carol, you challenged us with the question, how do you define risk? I'm going to challenge you with a question, what's the law?
What's the law?
There's one.
That's a great one.
There's one that I always point to, and it's CFR 42. in the.
What about
National
CFR?
Registry. It states basically that your facilities and equipment will be maintained in an
Right.
appropriate status.
Right, right,
To paraphrase.
right.
Maybe it's back to basics.
Right. That's a very interesting, no, but I agree with you. What is the law? I think that's something that we need to, right, because, right. The expectations on delivery of care, the clinical aspects, the maintenance of the technology, the creation of the technology, and the reimbursement for all that care and technology all comes inside the belt loop, I think. Actually, FDA is outside the belt, but that's okay.